loud. So something will probably pop up and say, is it okay if we record? So go ahead and hit yes. Thanks, Eileen Singleton. Eileen is our esteemed co-president of CJC. Thanks for joining us. And so I would just one more time run through our instructions. Again, I'm Bonnie Sorak. I am a CJC Green Team member. And I was the chairperson of our Green Team for 12 years. Took a little bit of a hiatus. And now Wendy Hall is our Green Team leader. And I also work, you can see, I work for an organization called Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake. I'm blessed to be doing this work, helping congregations to care for the environment all over the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So we're thrilled to host today's event. And we're always looking for new congregations to join our movement of faith congregations working to help creation. All right, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn it over to Irma. Irma is our wonderful Green Team member who just jumped in all in and coordinated today's presentation for you. So Irma, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Bonnie. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Irma Bensinger, and on behalf of Columbia Jewish Congregation's Green Team and Mensch Club, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's event, What Climate Change Means for Our Community. Our Green Team meets monthly to share ideas on how we can implement our commitment to environmental sustainability and justice based on Judaism's responsibility to protect creation. Past projects for the Green Team have included habitat cleanup, tree plantings, construction of rain gardens, and educational programs. In a few minutes, I'll introduce today's speaker, Dr. Peter Goodwin. But first, I'd like to introduce CJC member Jim Lovitz, who will read an opening prayer.
Yes, hello everyone. The title of this prayer / poem is We Hold the Earth. We hold brothers and sisters who suffer from storms and droughts intensified by climate change. We hold all species that suffer. We hold world leaders dedicated to make decisions for life. We pray that the web of life may be mended through courageous actions to limit carbon emissions. We pray for right action for adaptation and mitigation to help our already suffering Earth community. We pray that love and wisdom might inspire my actions and our actions as communities, so that we may, with integrity, look into the eyes of brothers and sisters and all beings and truthfully say, we are doing our part to care for them and the future of our children. May love transform us in our world with new steps toward life.
Thank you, Jim. And that actually comes from the National Climate Prayer. There is a National Prayer Day at noon your time on Earth Day, April 22nd, which is sponsored by Interfaith Power and Light, which is a religious response to global warming. Okay, I would like to now present Dr. Goodwin. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Peter Goodwin, Professor and President of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. He also serves as Vice Chancellor for Environmental Sustainability for the University of Maryland. Dr. Goodwin is an internationally recognized expert in ecosystem restoration, ecohydraulics, and enhancement of river, wetland, and estuarine systems. And he has spent 30 years in higher education. He has participated in projects around the world, include Chile, Guatemala, as well as here in the United States. Dr. Goodwin received his Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from the University of Southampton, United Kingdom, and his master's and doctoral degrees in hydraulic and coastal engineering from the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Goodwin will be discussing how climate change affects us, measures to mitigate and adapt globally, nationally, and here in Maryland, as well as the status of the 2022 Maryland Climate Solutions Now Act. Dr. Goodwin.
Okay, well, Irma, Thank you for those kind words, and thank you all for the invitation to say a few words this afternoon. And in particular, just thank you for your efforts around the environment. And Jim, that was really a beautiful opening prayer. So thank you for that. So what I thought I would do this afternoon, we really wanted to open this for questions, but I was going to talk for about 40 minutes, first of all, about the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, because not a lot of our residents in Maryland know about us or know our role. You might see our work, but not our function as an institution. And then, as Irma said, I was going to highlight where the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, sits right now, and then scale that down to what we can expect to see in Maryland in the coming decades. And then I'm going to finish this talk with just a few suggestions of what we can all do individually. So with those few comments, and also you caught me a little bit by surprise. I think this is the first meeting I've given to a Jewish group that has started on time. So that's, we don't do that out west. So what I'm going to do now is share screen. And okay, so am I in presentation mode?
You are, and if I can just suggest to everyone, I put it in the chat, if you go to your top right corner, if you're on a desktop computer where it says view, if you click on speaker or side-by-side speaker, you'll be able to see Peter and his slides, and that will make it all just kind of optimized for you. All right, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Bonnie. So first of all, what is this institution called the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science? We're just coming up to our centenary celebration. We were founded by Reginald Pruitt in 1925 on Solomon's Island. And for those of you who've visited that part of the state, our campus sits on the end of that island. There's about 26 buildings there. And when I came, I asked the question, how on earth could you be so visionary to have it essentially the first Institute of Marine Science established here in Maryland? It was way ahead of its time. And the answer is, of course, Reginald Pruitt was married to the governor's daughter, had the ear of the governor, and this remarkable center was founded at that time primarily to inform the state on the recovery of Chesapeake Bay. But the idea of this institution is to provide the science that guides and informs the state, the nation, and the world around sustainability issues. We are actually an independent university. We're one of the 12 universities within the University System of Maryland. And we just focus on graduate education. So our responsibility in our mission when we were founded was to work with others. As we'll see later in this talk, environmental issues are immensely complex, and we don't even pretend to have every available expert that's needed on many of these issues. But the importance of having an independent institution, we regard ourselves as the honest brokers of science to inform management and policy. And the importance of having that institution, as you're probably very aware, many of these environmental issues tend to be very controversial. And so we have the ability to put out the science. Sometimes there's groups that don't like what the science says, but no one's going to question the integrity or the longevity that UMCES has been studying many of these issues. And a couple of other things, we do many undergraduate and high school internships to try and inspire the next generation of environmental scientists to enter the field. All of our Graduate students are fully funded. We don't accept them unless they're fully funded on a research project. And what's also different, before I came to Maryland, I had done a spell in the Obama administration as the lead scientist overseeing the science to inform the state of California around its water issues, essentially balancing the water supply reliability for the large cities and the recovery of the ecosystems. And it was really a challenge there sometimes to get the experts out of the superb universities there from Stanford, from UCLA, Berkeley, and other institutions, because they would say, oh, Peter, I'd love to come and sit on this panel or advise this agency, but my dean has said, I've been away too much this semester and I need to be on campus. So then, of course, it would get elevated to the dean to ensure those very best scientists could be at the table guiding. At that time, it was the 2011 to 2016 drought that California went through. By having a university that has that primary role of supporting the state, we don't have those conflicts. And when we ask our faculty or students to attend meetings, to study a particular issue or to give advice, the only question we ever receive is, can I talk to my students about it? So nationally, it really is a unique institution. This is part of our mission that was established by the state legislature, and it's grown over time so that we now have positions in the state government on many of the large controversial issues that the state faces. But also not that well known, we have 6 locations spread across the state. Many of these locations are in the underserved parts of the state. So we also have the mission of reaching out to those communities to open doors to higher education. And in addition to those 6 locations, we have our research vessel, the Rachel Carson, that does a lot of the monitoring on Chesapeake Bay and our coastal waters. And as I mentioned, environmental issues, particularly with the complexities of climate change, it's really difficult to conduct science in the same way that we did 10, 15, 20 years ago, where you would pick a problem, you would study it, you would take action, and usually walk away or have minimal monitoring. Now we understand that ecosystems are intimately connected, and it's very difficult to take decisions, say, on shoreline protection against sea level rise without that having some type of impact on fisheries and other ecological values, as well as recreation and many other issues. And the other thing which you may have seen is that we do these report cards, not just for Maryland, but literally across the world. The annual report showing how we're doing in our efforts to recover the values of Chesapeake Bay. And most recently, we launched the first ever coastal adaptation report card, which is tracking the progress that Maryland is making in adapting to sea level rise and the increasing damages that we are seeing from weather and climate impacts. So that's who we are. And I mentioned things have changed dramatically over the last 10 years, particularly around urgency. And I went back while I was putting this presentation together and picked out a couple of presentations at science meetings I was at exactly 10 years ago. And back then, Tim Killeen, at the time, he was the head of the National Science Foundation Geosciences Directorate. And he threw out this challenge, not just to the research community, but to the US in general, that the challenge of maintaining and improving the quality of life within a healthy Earth system is incredibly difficult. And at that same time, I was at a presentation by Sir Martin Rees, at the time the Astronomer Royal from the UK, who chose a forum at the University of California, not to talk about astrophysics, but his entire talk was around the importance of taking action around sustainability, resilience, and the effects of climate change. And he pointed out that this is the first time in the Earth's history that the entire future of the planet rests in the hands of one species. And despite those warnings from truly some of the top scientists in the world, very little happened in that following decade. And here I've picked out a publication from Bioscience that appeared at the end of 2019. There's now well over 20,000 scientists have signed on to this letter. But it was highlighting the consequences if we don't take urgent action around climate change, particularly limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. And the consequences of climate are just piling up. As you can see in this graph here, I just randomly picked a few articles from major weather and climate-related disasters from across the world from last summer. And it's truly staggering. There is signs of good news. There was some wonderful wording put out by the heads of government and politicians last year. The incoming president of the European Commission said that climate was going to be the #1 priority during the last year. And the United States and China had 2 joint statements throughout the year committed to working together to address climate change. This is also a brief summary of some of the other statements that were made leading up to the Conference of Parties that I'll talk about in a few minutes. So last year, there was a lot of promises being made, and the question was the action to follow that up? So in November last year, we had the Conference of Parties, which is the group that is making national commitments to address the increasing concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the objectives of that conference had 4 main goals. The first is to maintain within the 1.5 degrees Celsius. The second is to protect people and the natural habitats and the environments they live in. The third was to look at innovative ways of mobilizing finance to accelerate progress around climate change. And the fourth was a commitment to work together. Maryland was well represented at this conference, including our Secretary of the Environment, Ben Grumbles. Of course, there's been changes in the last few weeks. And while the scientists were questioning the value and looking at the data that are associated with the promises made last year, I think that most compelling talk that I heard was by one of the IPCC scientists that has been working on AR6. And I'm not sure if anyone else saw her interview. She was in a basement in Ukraine and doing an interview around the IPCC report she had been working on. And she started by just saying, as terrible as the things are that are going on in my country right now, that this war is doing 2 things. First of all, it's diverting attention from the climate change crisis, which has the potential to kill far more people globally over the coming decades than a single war event. But there was also a message of hope that she threw out that showed that when people pull together, how quickly you can make a difference. So for Dr. Krakowska. Our thanks go out for her for keeping the climate when she's under the worst possible personal situation. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the IPCC reports. Currently this year, we're going through the 6th assessment. These are reports that are published about every 5 to 7 years. And the first of 3 working group reports came out in August last year. The third was published just last week. And these 3 major reports are then summarized in a synthesis document, which will be due out in the next few weeks. And the important thing to recognize with these IPCC reports is that they're not doing new research when they come up with these reports. Their job is to synthesize the peer-reviewed research and scientifically credible research from across the world and pull this together into an assessment of where we are. So looking at this first working group report that came out last year, there were over 230 authors that synthesized more than 14,000 different scientific references to come up with this report. And the conclusions were stark. For the first time, these previous reports had put a % of certainty around most of their conclusions. What was different in this report that they used words like it is unequivocal that human influence is creating climate change. We had never seen that before, and it's very unusual for scientists to speak in these terms. And among other conclusions is that this cycle that we're seeing of the intensification of the global water cycle, greater variability, greater severity is not only continuing, but it's accelerating. These reports have also highlighted that things are worse than we had projected or understood, and more than 40% of the world's population is highly vulnerable to these consequences. They also highlighted that the losses and damages we're seeing are real and significant. Many of those communities and countries that are hurt the worst are those segments that are making the smallest contribution to the problem. So one of the big issues in COP26 and in this report is who pays if you're a poor country or you're an underserved, overburdened community here in the US, who pays for these challenges? The third conclusion, which was really important, is we know we have to rely on technology, but we can't sit back and wait for technology to come up with a magic fix. And there were many examples in this report about the timeline it's going to take to get these technologies online. And secondly, for example, with direct carbon capture, unless you have a free, clean energy source, it's going to be very difficult to put in place direct carbon capture techniques because of the huge energy requirements that are needed. The fourth area, and this is, I think, has great relevance to Maryland, is that city offers great opportunities. Some of the technology around smart cities, the ability to make a big contribution in transportation greenhouse gas emissions, we're likely to get much more bang for our buck by focusing on high density of population like cities. And most importantly, the conclusion was we can still avoid the very worst effects of climate change, providing we take significant action now. So how are we doing with greenhouse gas emissions worldwide? Because of COVID in 2020, across the world, we saw about a 6% reduction in greenhouse gases. And this was certainly a cause for optimism. But as the data begun to come in from 2021, the bounce back in terms of greenhouse gas emissions was alarming. And for 2021, the latest figures showed that 6% reduction we had seen in 2020 was actually more than compensated by the bounce back in 2021. The third conclusion of the IPCC around this was that it's about 400 gigatons we have left to put into our atmosphere before we pass the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. If we continue at the 2021 rate of emissions, we will have passed that concentration accumulation in the atmosphere sometime in the 2030s, so nowhere near the end of the century. This is just a slide that shows, unfortunately, there are still those that believe that climate change is not human induced and our ability to predict global warming is uncertain. This is a paper that really dismissed that. They look back at the 17 major models used to forecast climate change, and essentially all of those models, when the correct assumptions or the correct data were put in those models, it showed that virtually all of the models, all but 2 of those models, were incredibly accurate in predicting how fast our atmosphere is warming. I thought I would just smile here. There's a lot of alternative facts out there on climate change. Here I've just picked a few, and like all alternative facts, they're often based somewhat on truth and then twisted to give a totally different story of what the science is actually saying. So here I'll just run through a few of those. That global warming's nothing to do with our effects. It's actually due to natural fluctuations in the sun's energy. And this is certainly true. The sun's energy goes through cycles. It's well documented in the scientific literature. But we are going into a weaker phase, but the effects that the sun has on these fluctuations is really very, very small, less than 0.2 of a degree Celsius, compared with this potentially 3 degrees Celsius we're facing by the end of this century. Secondly, if it was true that these fluctuations in the sun's energy is what's driving global warming, we would expect the entire atmosphere to be changing. And we don't see that. In fact, the stratosphere is actually cooling, and it's the layers of the atmosphere closest to the Earth where we're seeing the temperature increases. Perhaps for Irma, as a medical doctor, you'll also see out there that global warming is actually a good thing because cold weather kills more people than extreme heat. This is true worldwide through 2019. But as we saw in 2021, the number of deaths that have been associated with the extreme heat dome that we saw in the northwest of the US was something like 4,000 deaths. As our atmosphere warms, we see more of the extremes, more extreme flooding, more droughts, more famine, more war, as water shortages exacerbated by climate change are experienced. There's likely to be more interboundary conflicts. And some countries, like the Maldives, will just face extinction under sea level rise. Another common fact that's out there that we can't afford to do anything about climate change. If it does, we'll see a decline in our quality of life, and fossil fuels are essential for economic growth. And the fact there that's true is that the Industrial Revolution enabled the wealth in countries like the US. So that part of it's true. But in many parts of the world now, renewable energy is much cheaper than coal, oil, or gas. And as our technologies around energy storage are emerging, we're just going to see this trend accelerate. But more importantly, with these increases in weather-related disasters, and I'll give some statistics on this at the moment, it's been predicted that by mid-century, the global economy will shrink by 18% as a result of the disruptions caused by natural weather-related disasters. And from the ethical point of view, it's the poorest communities and the poorest countries which are always the most vulnerable. The wealthy folks can move or can buy those commodities if they get into short supply. So now let's start to bring this down to what's happening in the United States. Since 1980, NOAA has been tracking the number of billion-dollar weather and climate-related disasters in the United States. And as you can see in this figure here, we're seeing an exponential increase in the frequency, the severity, and the cost of these weather-related disasters. So this covers everything from wildfire to hurricanes, severe storm, and the intense rainstorms which we've seen in Baton Rouge, Houston, and Ellicott City here in Maryland. So we're seeing these rapidly related changes. And before we got started today, we were chatting about what it's like to be in Maryland, in a state that understands climate change, values higher education, values K through 12 education. And we're also in a state that really understands many of these issues. Here I picked the Goucher College poll from March of this year. And in this poll, they asked Marylanders their opinion about how serious they felt some of the impacts we're experiencing from climate change. And what's interesting in this, there's a huge majority that thinks it's impacting our way of life. And for many of these issues like rising sea levels, extreme weather, about 55% are saying it's having a major impact and we really need to be taking the effects of climate seriously. I just point out that nationally, these are figures that don't always hold up. Also in this state, we have scientists across our institutions that are analyzing and making predictions of what we can expect in the future. This is just one example. My colleague, Matt Fitzpatrick, who has been looking at the climate change models. And you can go onto his webpage, which he's working with Google, and it's being expanded worldwide. But you can pick the city that you live in. And in 80 years from now, essentially in one lifetime, you can see what the climate is going to be like 60 years from now. And so for Baltimore, the climate conditions are going to be very similar to northern Mississippi. And here we're expecting much warmer summers, drier summers, wetter winters, but also much warmer winters. And storms are going to be far more intense. So we have a good understanding of the conditions we might see. So we really have no excuse. Taking that NOAA data that I showed a minute ago and drilling down for what we're experiencing in Maryland. In the first decade that NOAA started this survey, we were experiencing about $1 billion disaster or more every other year through the 1980s. Over time, we're seeing more of these events, so that in the period 2018 to 2020, we were averaging 4 of these types of events per year. Who pays? Of course, Marylanders carry the brunt of that, either through paying taxes or by direct impacts to food prices or our properties. Some of the other consequences we can see, one of the functions that UMSES has is every 5 years, we have to update the sea level rise projections for the state of Maryland. Our last one was in 2018. And the projected rise by the turn of the century is somewhere between 1.5 and 4.2 feet. But at that time in 2018, we weren't sure how the cryosphere or the frozen parts of the planet were responding to climate change. And as you've probably seen in the popular press, the more we understand about the rapid melting of Greenland, of the Arctic, and the knock-on effects of that is really quite scary. So in the 2018 report, we made 2 projections. One was with the current rate of melting. And then the second projection we made was on the basis of more rapid ice loss. Of course, a huge amount of uncertainty. But essentially, this could mean 4 to 8 feet of sea level rise in Chesapeake Bay by the end of this century. And if you just think of the number of homes, the low-lying areas around Chesapeake Bay, this will be catastrophic. I think you're familiar with this wonderful documentary, High Tide in Dorchester County. If you haven't seen it, I would certainly encourage you. It's freely available at many places on the web, on YouTube, through a group called IAHR. But it really captures the human side of sea level rise, the sunny day flooding we're seeing just from normal high level tides without the effects of storm surge. And putting these projections into computer models, this is one example that shows what would happen if the 2003 hurricane that affected Chesapeake Bay created flooding, certainly in the top end of the bay. What happened if exactly that same storm hit Chesapeake Bay with sea level rise? And the consequences are staggering. Even in 2003 property damages, we're seeing somewhere between 8 and 12 times the increase in damages associated with that. Here I just... And perhaps for Irma, just one other thing, what can we expect in terms of human health? This is something that's sometimes overlooked. And to address this, the University of Maryland College Park School of Public Health and our Department of Health produced a report that looked at the effect of extreme weather conditions on hospitalizations in the period 2000 to 2012, and then used that information to make projections on our future climate as to what we could see. And what that showed was that under extreme precipitation, the number of hospitalizations associated with asthma increased by about 11%. And under extreme heat, we saw a 22% increase in hospitalizations due to asthma. Looking into the future, using the models like Dr. Fitzpatrick uses, we can expect by 2040 to see an increase of over 130% in hospitalizations for asthma. So all of these brief summaries, and there's many other aspects, of course, has made Maryland very, very sensitive to climate change. And even though we're a small state, it was realized that we're also one of the most impacted states by the consequences of climate change. This is the Maryland Commission on Climate Change webpage. And I'd certainly encourage you to look at that for a lot of data and for you to see the depth of analysis by state scientists and experts that develop the science and information that informs Maryland's way forward. And it's very true to say that Maryland is a leader in addressing climate change. And I think we can take great pride that we've been addressing that in a purple manner. that particularly during the last 8 years, and it's really been a model for many of our other states across the US. So a very brief history. The first Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act was put in place in 2009. This required a 25% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from 2006 levels. This was increased in 2016, requiring a 40% reduction by 2030, or the 40 by 30. The Climate Solutions Act of 2022, which the governor allowed to pass through without signature just a couple of days ago, is truly transformative. It will mean that we as a state will be net zero by 2045, which goes beyond the Paris Climate Accord. But this has to be done, and both for the 2016 Act and 2022, it puts some very severe constraints on how we get there. So just as an example, it has to be done in a way that promotes new green jobs, protects existing jobs. So there has to be a net job growth. There has to be job training for those workers who will lose jobs as a result of this shift. And it has to be done in a way that doesn't undermine the state's economic well-being, meaning growth. It also requires that there needs to be a 60% greenhouse gas reduction in 2031. So these are very lofty goals, particularly when we're working within the constraints. And one of the great things about Maryland is they don't just pass a law and set these targets. There's very rigorous testing and monitoring to ensure that the state is achieving the letter of the state law. And the last couple of things I wanted to mention about this that also places this state as something special is that the principles of environmental justice are embedded throughout this bill. It defines underserved, overburdened communities. It defines environmental justice. And if we look at point 10 here in the bill, that it also says that every step of this transition that the state's going to go through has to be on the basis of best available scientific information. And if there's any scientists listening in, we tend to have a knee-jerk reaction to that term, but it's actually federally defined. So what I'd like to do is just cover a couple of other issues. And going back to my comment about we need to look at Maryland as a system and it's climate change, but every action we take around climate change has other knock-on benefits. So we're in the process of making great progress on cleaning up Chesapeake Bay, bringing back the natural resources. And since 2004, when we would experience these large parts of the bay being a dead zone, that means very low oxygen levels to the point that life cannot be sustained. We've really come a long way. And we've done that by reducing pollution. Many of these actions that have been taken not only benefit the bay, they benefit air quality, and they also make great strides in our adaptation to climate change and reduction of emissions. So the progress we've made have been really quite remarkable in nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment. We're well on track for both phosphorus and sediment reductions. Nitrogen is still a major problem we're facing. But part of that reduction we're seeing is because of the scrubbers that are on the dirty power plants upwind of us. And it's part of why the state of Maryland was so concerned with the lowering of air quality standards and the reintroduction of coal-powered power plants under the previous administration. So here we are, we're cleaning up the bay. We have best management practices for managing land, managing runoff from our properties. And then you get hit with these extreme events. And the question is, are these best management practices we're putting in place all for nothing? If we are facing an increase in these events, or can we manage the effects of climate to continue the improvements we see in bay quality? And if you want to follow our progress, the impacts of climate change, of course, these report cards capture the impacts and also how bad the bay would be when we experience those very wet times if we weren't doing all of these other actions to address both climate change. So what I'd like to do in the last few minutes is just to respond to Irma's question and what can I do? And I know as a group, you're extremely sophisticated. You're doing some wonderful things across Maryland. But often communities, and I'm sure you encounter this when you're talking with colleagues and others in your community, that the problem is just too big for me to make a difference. Maryland's too small to make a difference. First of all, what I'd like to say is when we do things in Maryland and we do it in a bipartisan manner, it sends such an incredible message about the existential threat that we're facing and how to put these things in place. So my first suggestion would be, we have some wonderful politicians. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to name them, but of course, Senator Pinsky, Chair Barve, Senator Alfrith, Brooke Blairman, many other state legislators that have really put their professional reputations on the line for many years to get these actions like the Climate Action Now 2022 bill passed. So please say thank you. We really appreciate the job that they're doing. Is there more that we can do? Of course. Many of the recommendations of the Climate Commission did not get included. It didn't make it through the legislature this year, particularly around transportation and buildings. But the progress that we did make is quite remarkable. And now what I'd like to do is, I'm sure you're very familiar just hearing some of the discussion earlier about the 5 obvious actions which you can take. But I wanted to illustrate some of the communication tools and the internal competitions that you might want to set up in your communities to do this. First of all, there are these wonderful online tools. The EPA has this carbon footprint calculator where you can go on as a family and step through all of the steps which you could take to reduce your carbon footprint as a family. And a series of pull down menus. You can go through that. When I ran through this, we're in the process of getting an electric car. Not everyone can afford an electric car, but I just wanted to see the potential impact that that would have. And so what this does is show your current carbon footprint as a family, what it will look like after you've taken a series of actions, and then puts you alongside a similar family within the US. So a wonderful communications tool. And then it tells you in a given year what your efforts are equivalent to doing, how much gas you save, how many trees you would need to plant to get the same level of carbon sequestration. And then, of course, if you were to encourage your colleagues to take the same actions, it tells you what the potential savings could be over 5 years. So very quickly, these cumulative actions start adding up to something seriously. And the last part of this webpage, if you haven't seen it, it can actually document how much you save in your annual budget by taking these simple actions. And as a couple of other points to illustrate this, I was giving a talk in Australia a few years ago, and there was the director of the water agency for this large Australian city, and he was saying that they were in the process of going through and installing low flow shower heads on every house in their water agency's district. It was being done for free. And it was at the time of the Australian drought. And in the panel discussion, I said, well, you're doing that to save water. And he just looked and said, no, no, the drought will be over in 3 or 4 years. We're doing this to minimize carbon emissions. And so here, I'll leave the talk with you, but it's just very interesting to do the calculation between different shower heads, how much energy that you consume by not heating so much water, what are your cost savings? And this is just part of the story. The water comes to your house, it's been pumped there, it's been treated, there's costs associated with that. But when the water drains from your home, it leaves the house, it has to be pumped somewhere, it has to be treated and then discharged. So reducing that use of water has far more impact than you might at first think. And if you want to calculate your water footprint, there's several out there. And as water becomes more scarce or comes at different times, it's something we should all be aware of. And here I just gave the PBS link that on the series they did on water, and you can calculate your water footprint as well as your carbon footprint. So in conclusion, I think there is a time for optimism. I think having states like Maryland taking such aggressive action is inspiring. Many of the statements which were made by the G20 countries last year that provide 75% of the greenhouse gases still today, they're at least verbal promises that were made last year leading up to COP26 is a cause for hope. But we have to take action now. We can't wait for technology. We can't wait to see what other countries are doing. And the third point I would make, we're also very fortunate to be in a state that not only prides education, including environmental education, but the number of innovative centers at Johns Hopkins, College Park, UMBC, UMB, that have teams of researchers working on all aspects of mitigation, reducing greenhouse gases, clean energy, adaptation science. How are we going to respond to a possible 7-foot rise in sea level? And perhaps most important, the climate justice aspect of this existential threat that we face. So with that, Bonnie, I'll stop there and be very happy to field any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And what I would suggest to everyone, I'm going to, on my own, I'm going to put us into gallery view so we can go back to seeing everyone's faces. And we did go ahead and put your questions. We did get a couple questions come in while you were presenting. So I will go and see what those were. Let's see. You kind of touched on this at one point. I'm going to go back to, I think what's on everyone's minds right now is Ukraine. And you talked about the scientists there. Mike Levine said, the Ukraine situation once again demonstrates people's willingness to sacrifice as long as it does not directly affect them. How do we therefore address the oil issue?
Well, what a great question. And as the Ukrainian scientist said so clearly, it's the oil that's funding the war effort right now. And I think that it's a challenge. What we've heard is that from many countries that over the next 12 months, there's going to be a withdrawal from reliance on Russian gas. And it's also worth pointing out that there were one country that was not reducing their greenhouse gas emissions associated with the oil and gas industry. So I think it's just really challenging to, particularly for the large European companies that have been so highly reliant on Russian oil. And I would say just stay tuned. What we're hearing right now is there's likely to be a rapid removal or away from that one source. It seems the US is going to step up and help. But I would also highlight the comment that was made that, does that mean that we move back to fracking and other sources in this country that we've been moving away from, specifically to fill that energy gap in Europe? So I really don't have any answers to that in the short term. I think it's certainly accelerating innovation in renewable energy, clean energy sources. It's likely to focus perhaps on these micro-nuclear generating stations that the environmental community has been very much in two minds about. But perhaps the only advantage to say is it has brought focus very clearly back on fossil fuels and our need to wean off those quickly. So I'm not sure if anyone else in this group who are maybe perhaps more in the diplomacy areas may have something to add to that.
I'd like to say something.
You're not on mute. You have to write it.
No, actually, Simon, go ahead. We can hear you.
Okay. You talk in generalities. We get down to specifics. Germany had a policy of going green since the start of this century. They pushed it and pushed it. And what do they end up with? Closing down their nuclear power plants and using more coal and oil from Russia and gas, particularly gas. So renewables are not necessarily the answer unless you're willing to accept nuclear. It's a terrible time to promote nuclear because of the wars that are going on in the world. But in the long run, it's the only answer that will take care of the 7.5 billion people that are on the face of the earth now, and 9 billion will be about 2050. No other approach will work. There's a factor that I've been involved in energy for the last 40 years, and I've been aware of the problem since 37 years about global warming. There's a fact that you need to keep in mind, that the energy recovered for energy expended is bad for most renewables in most situations. Energy recovered or energy expended is a factor that you have to keep in account. And most people don't do that when they cite a renewable energy source, particularly for biofuels. It's around 1, or worse than 1, like a fraction. And we can't continue to promote renewables if we don't take into account that they won't get us to the net zero. Net zero is a fictitious number. There's not such a thing as net zero if there are people on this face of this earth.
All right, Simon,
That's
thanks. Let's let Peter react to that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, actually, Simon, I think much of what you said there is right on. And one of the challenges, of course, with nuclear is that even if you were to start designing a plant or constructing a plant today, there's It's not going to solve this problem with what do we do in the next decade. If we're to limit to the 1.5 degrees Celsius, and I'm sure everyone on this is fully aware that the reason that threshold has been set is that we really cannot predict all of the feedback mechanisms if we exceed that 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we're just moving into a new space. But Simon's absolutely right with renewables. The big challenge we face right now is it's the storage. It's fine when the sun's shining, when the wind's blowing. And of course, energy storage, the group at College Park actually have some of the world's very best researchers looking at those issues. So I think it's also one of those areas that we may be seeing major step forward on a shorter time frame.
Thank you. We had a question come in from Alex Ross, and bear with me, so I'll read you what he said. So much of residential landscaping decisions in our area are based around grass lawns. I am a good example of that. I tried to use an organic approach to lawn maintenance, but one year that I did that with a lawn company was not effective. They said they knew how to do this, but it appeared that they had no real knowledge beyond application of organic fertilizer and laying off of weed killers. In addition, it is not easy to find lawn company that highlights wildflower indigenous plant approach or Japanese style rock garden approach. I know of only one state that certifies and trains lawn companies on how to apply organic approach to lawn maintenance. He thinks it's Connecticut. His question is, what has been your experience on this issue? And do you have any suggestions on what we can do and what our elected officials can do here in Howard County to encourage these approaches?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's certainly beyond my expertise. Just a couple of thoughts around that. I would be very surprised if DNR or MDE didn't have experts that are looking at that, because they're the folks that are putting together the best practices to limit runoff, but both of chemicals and the nutrients into the bay. So that's a good, a good question. I'd certainly be willing just to look into that a little bit the next time I'm with someone from DNR and shoot you a note about it. Because yes, it's an issue. The other thing that I would also encourage, there's the lawn maintenance, but also thinking about the control of runoff from your personal home. And the more you can hold the water on your property before it drains off, that really helps in where that water's accumulating and the capacity of the storm sewer systems that have to manage that. Yes.
Thank you. I'll just add, Alex, there is through the University of Maryland, they do have a program called Certified Bay Landscaping Professionals. So there is actually a program that landscapers can go through to become Certified Bay Landscape Professionals. So when you're shopping for your landscaper, that is a certification that you should look for, and they would be ones that should have gone through training about that specific issue. I'll also say that we are really blessed in Howard County through our Cleanscapes program. Just like Peter says, you can get reimbursed for if you install a rain garden and rain barrels and cisterns on your property. The county will reimburse you up to 75% of those costs. So it's definitely something to look into if you're looking to treat the runoff from your property. And it's something that our congregation is also looking at as far as applying for grants to. We already do a lot of that with our rain gardens, but we're talking about maybe adding some more. So. And
actually, Bonnie, just to add to that, of course, our Chesapeake Bay Trust,
yes.
The license plate funding, they really do a great job in giving grants to communities. So if you have something fun, particularly innovative, that really is a wonderful organization.
Yes, absolutely. I'm curious, and I hope if I can step in and ask a question of Rabbi Fink, since you're still on the line with us and have been so generous to join us from Idaho. From my organization's perspective, we come at this and so much information has been presented here today. Just thank you so much. About the faith perspective on all of this. What is, we have all this information, but that doesn't seem necessarily to motivate people. And what we look at is trying to use people's faith as another factor. Is if it's not all this information, if not the overwhelming preponderance of information will motivate people to take action, how can communities of faith step in and try to make this clear to folks? If you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. Thanks, Bonnie. And first, thanks so much. Gratitude to Dr. Goodwin. It's what a pleasure. I think at the beginning, you mentioned Interfaith Power and Light. Interfaith Power and Light does great work. We actually are just about a year into starting up a program here in Boise, and this is what they do. They bring together faith communities and speak. Okay, sorry about that. I think I got muted. So they speak out of the language of faith traditions, and what people have recognized is that climate is very much a scientific, an ethical problem, as we've heard today. It's also a spiritual challenge. And that's where faith communities have an important role to play. All of our traditions talk about living modestly. We have in the book of Leviticus, in just a couple of weeks, for those who are following the Torah cycle, we'll be reading Portion Bahar, which is about the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year, where we're commanded to give the land a rest every 7 years. And that's accompanied by redistribution of land and of assets. Debts are forgiven. So there's a connection between economics and politics and spirituality. We all have traditions, and there's a lot of good work being done in faith communities. I'll just offer one quote from Ecclesiastes Rabbah, which is a midrash on the book of Ecclesiastes, where it says that before making this world, God created and destroyed many worlds. That this was not, the first draft, and God places Adam and Chava in the garden after creating this world and says, I have created and destroyed many worlds. This is the last one that I'm going to make. It's in your hands. And so if our religious traditions can move us to recognize the responsibilities that we have, so thank you. Thanks for asking.
Thanks, Rabbi. I have one more question, and if last call, because Peter's been so generous with his time with us today. This one's from Jim Lubitz. He says, how are greenhouse gas emissions measured on the national and subnational levels? Are the measures accurate, and can countries cheat?
Yeah, actually, great question. Short answer is no, because NASA and US technology is using satellites. There's a lot of ground truthing around that. So we have a pretty good handle on emissions. And particularly in this state, I'd like to make a call out to my colleague Russ Dickerson at College Park. He works with NIST and NASA, and they're testing a lot of it's not only state of the art, it's not even out there yet. And so in this region, we have extraordinarily accurate records. And I mentioned there methane that actually got written into the bill. So our legislature is very aware of that research that's going on. So they can pinpoint for methane, for example, landfills and communities where there's the possibility of leakage of methane or natural gas. So the short answer is we got a pretty good handle on that with satellite technology. We have a good idea. And in one of those reports, the Carbon Disclosure Project, that's how we can get numbers on the difference between the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions or the promises that countries are making and what they're actually doing. And so it's often called the gap. There's a gap report by WMO, and there's a Carbon Disclosure Project actually documents to quite a high degree of accuracy how different countries are doing. And for us here in Maryland, it gives us a very good handle on how well we're doing in meeting the state laws that have been set. So great question.
I'd
And if I
like
could-
to add a comment there.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about the satellite imagery, but I'm talking about the report that's reported. International IPCC is so political, it doesn't count all the emissions that are emitted. For example, biofuels are not, emissions from biofuels are not counted. Emissions that result from burning of fuels from all kinds of biofuels are not counted, but under their system or in the past. I don't know if it has changed. So it's a good thing that we're doing it, we're monitoring it by satellite, but because the reported emissions from each country do not include that, particularly countries that should know better, like European countries, the United States.
Great.
That's just a comment.
All right. Thanks, Simon. Great. Anyone else? Last chance. I'll just say thank you, Irma. I'm sure that you have some notes of gratitude that you would like to share, being the one that took the lead on this.
Yes, thank you, Peter. This is wonderful. We are so happy that you were able to speak with us today, and I'm so grateful to everyone that participated as well today, as well as our wonderful green team and other congregations that joined us. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and we did record this. I did have that question earlier. It'll take us a day or two to get this up on our YouTube channel, but then we will make that available for you to share with other folks that were not available to join us today. So thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and I just love the questions. So I hope one of these days we'll have an opportunity to be face to face. And I'd also like to give a big thank you to Rabbi Dan for joining. Great to see you, Dan.
Thank you.
You learn from him every time.
It's wonderful. Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Peter.